So we still have 1 minute while people log on, but I just wanted to let everybody know. So a couple different, just one quick housekeeping thing at the beginning. We're using our regular Zoom as opposed to our webinar Zoom. So that means that, we can see participants and their videos. So all of you who have joined us as a guest, please know that we are recording. I just want to let you know that right away. So you could decide if you wanted to, mute your camera or not. So, but otherwise, I'll leave that decision to you, and I'll remind you in a moment that we are doing the recording. But let's go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. This is the 4th episode of Food System Fridays, organized by the Sustainable Food Systems faculty at Prescott College. My name is Robin Curry, and I'm the director of the Master of Science in Sustainable Food Systems program, which is an online program. Even before COVID, we were online. And we seek to support students in their efforts to build more sustainable food systems in their communities. And we actually have one of our current students as the panelist, and I saw some current students and alumni of the program as participants were loading into the webinar. We're very intentionally online, as I mentioned, before COVID also, because college towns seem to collect a disproportionate number of academic activists, but our hometowns is where our students are needed. They're needed so they can be applying what they're learning in the classroom to improve their food systems. There are families all over the country, like many of you, who are encountering situations where you cannot find the kinds of foods that you're used to in the amounts that you're used to. The spotlight is on food supply chains, and clearly many of our existing food systems are not equitably ensuring food for all, even in the best of times. For those of you who are less familiar, a food system encompasses all the stages of keeping us nourished. It's the growing, the harvesting, the packing, the processing, transforming, marketing, consuming, and disposing of food. At the MSFS program, we are advocates for sustainable diets, and those are diets with low environmental impacts, most often with local supply chains that can play an important role in ensuring food and nutrition security. As a faculty, we have been thinking and have been really concerned about the increased vulnerability to food insecurity that has happened as a result of isolation measures associated with the COVID-19 virus. This shows us more now than ever that we have important work to do to ensure safe, resilient food systems. But the big question is, how do we get it right? The Food System Friday series for the near future focuses on policies, practices, and people who can show us and help us learn about models of sustainable food systems and communities. We'll be back at this exact same time next week for another webinar and engaging panel discussion. We're going to be focusing on the topic of sustainable eating and how dietary guidelines can protect our health and the environment. If we're mindful that dietary guidelines establish the basis for public nutrition and health and agricultural policies, what happens from a policy standpoint in the designation of the recommendations that are coming from our government programs and our dietitians, really that's an opportunity for change in food systems if we're incorporating sustainability concepts in that. So this is looking with a little bit of a longer lens on food system sustainability and sustainable diets for next week. We'll be joined by Sarah Reinhardt from the Union of Concerned Scientists. She's a registered dietitian, Sharon Palmer, known as the plant-powered dietitian, and she's also faculty with us here at Prescott College, and also Chris Vogliano, who is a food security research fellow with Biodiversity International. All of them are experts in food-based dietary guidelines. So, to this week, as I mentioned, here's our Zoom protocol. We've all become experts in the last few months, but I wanted to remind you about a couple things. One is that hopefully you're all muted. And the reason is that we really want to hear the panelists. And so we ask you to please keep your microphones muted. And your cameras were automatically turned off as you came in because, you know, we're all working from home these days. And it's up to you to decide if you'd like your camera on or off. So the webinar is being recorded because a lot of folks just can't be available at this time, but are interested about the topic. And also the chat will be distributed. So please just be mindful that you know, the content is being recorded. I hope that you do participate in chat because I would love for all of you who've joined us today to please introduce yourselves and let us know which organization that you're affiliated with. And please feel free to participate. It's an open invitation to participate in the chat. If you know the answer to a question that somebody has asked, by all means, pop on in there and address their question. Please know that participation in chat is essentially you're consenting to allow us to distribute that later and to distribute the resources that you might share. I mean, this is about food systems and about helping everybody know where to go to get the right information just in time. And so the in the chat, that's where you can be asking questions of the panelists, and we'll be monitoring in there and be collating them. So don't worry, we'll get your questions asked, and we're willing to stay past the 1 hour mark to make sure that all of your questions get addressed as best as possible. For the chat function, the way it works, if you're new to this, is if you hover your mouse either at the bottom of the screen or at the top of the screen, depends on how you've got it set up. And for some of you, depending on your screen size, you may need to look at those 3 little dots, and click on that. You'll see that you have various options in there. And one option is the chat option. So you can go ahead and click on that chat option and it'll pull up a separate little box. And that's where there's an ongoing conversation. So you can also communicate with individuals privately or with everyone, and just don't mess that up. So the way that you can do is you can scroll through, and since this is about sharing resources, please default to everyone unless you have a specific question for a specific person. So again, an invitation, please contribute, please participate. This is a community building space, and hope that you will introduce yourself, say hello, and maybe even why you were interested in participating in today's webinar, because that can help us address your questions. So now to the real reason we're here, the panel. So as I mentioned before, we're looking for ideas on how to get this right. You know, how we address food system sustainability, not just in the short term, which is critically important because in different areas of the country and depending on individual circumstances, people really are in a crisis mode, but also to pay attention to these failures in the food system to help us think about how to address food insecurity and food system sustainability in the long term. And what better way to think about long term than considering the actual foundations of community food security, which is educating students about how to grow and about food systems. And so that's why we focus our theme today on long-term food system transformation on community gardens and school gardens. We know they play an essential role in education and food security. And we have 2 of our Prescott College faculty facilitating conversation about this with our guest panelists. So let me first introduce our co-hosts. So Eleanor Tyson is co-director of our core curriculum here at Prescott College in Arizona and teaches courses in food justice, agroecology, and food preservation. Eleanor has been involved in the founding of just about every single school or community garden that I know of where we used to live in Vermont. She has specific expertise in ethnoecology, seed conservation, and food systems education. Wendy Sue Harper is here, Dr. Wendy Sue Harper. She's an educator, soil scientist, and an organic farm inspector. At Prescott College, she teaches theory and practice in agroecological systems and food system biodiversity conservation in the marketplace. Wendy Sue is joining us today from Vermont, and so handing it over to you, Wendy Sue.
Thank you so much, Robin, for that nice introduction. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to introduce this topic to help everyone understand the importance of both school gardens and community gardens. And with first a few statistics. In 2018, the Trust for Public Land said that community gardens were growing faster than ever, and there were 29,000 garden plots in city parks in just the 100 largest cities in the US. And that doesn't count everywhere else. Reuters said that there are over 7,000 community gardens and over 44% of schools grow edible gardens. And that was for the 2013-2014 school year. The benefits from school and community gardens include increased access to fruits and vegetables and their consumption, which improves food security. And this is especially important in areas called food deserts because they do not have easy access to healthy, nutritious foods. School and community gardens also increase physical activity, which helps reduce obesity rates, and they improve a community sense of being a community and neighborhood safety, as well as providing a sense of well-being for people gardening. Community and school gardens are impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, such as restricted access to sites and social distancing. New protocols for safe gardening are being put in place to limit people's exposure to each other and ensure shared equipment is properly cleaned and people have adequate access to hand washing stations and more. And we have some links in the resources or links to resources that I'm gonna put in the chat box right now. Let me just do that. So you're gonna see those that Eleanor and I came up with. So today we have three panelists who will help us understand the issues school and community gardens are facing. We wanted experts from vastly different regions of the United States who work with either school gardens, community gardens, or both, that focused on management or coordination or education that could address these issues. So I would like to identify the panelists, and they are, and if you could just raise your hand and smile, Christine Gall from Burlington, Vermont, Donna Isaac from Campty, Louisiana, and Laura Plout from Bellingham, Washington. Now, each panelist will identify themselves and tell what their organization's programs do and where. We have asked them to discuss how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted their mission and activities and the region. And we've also asked them to share with us ideas on how to move forward, especially with the growing season upon us. And Christine, perhaps you could start.
Sure thing. Thank you for that introduction, Wendy Sue. So my name is Christine Gall, and I am the current MSFS student that Robin mentioned earlier. I've been involved in food-based learning and agriculture for just over a decade, and as such, we'll be sharing a bit about my current work with and in support of school gardens in particular. So I live in Burlington, Vermont, which is really a hotbed of farm-to-school activities, and I split my week between two partnered organizations, the first being the Burlington School Food Project. BSFP, for short, is the in-house food service department of our city's school district. So we provide breakfast, lunch, snack, and supper to roughly 3,500 students a day. But the department also heads up the farm to school initiatives within our district. And these farm to school programs extend beyond cafeteria-centric local procurement efforts to the work that I do as a garden education coordinator. So I teach cooking and gardening classes throughout the school year. I provide guidance and resources to our elementary school garden committees. I manage our district's greenhouse and our 2 larger production gardens, which total about a ½ acre of growing space. And over the summer, I help lead a student-run food truck. And our food truck uses lots of produce from our school gardens during those months. And then come the school year, our harvest typically goes to our cafeterias or straight into classrooms for tasting and cooking activities. Additionally, I work for a Burlington-based national level nonprofit called Kids Gardening. And we provide resources to youth garden programs across the country, whether they be affiliated with schools or not. So we create and provide garden-based lesson plans and activities, some of which are available free on our website, and others that are published print curricula. And we also have a pretty robust set of grant programs that folks can apply to for funding and supplies. So we're really just like a youth garden support organization. And as the educational specialist for Kids Gardening, I largely focus on implementing these grant programs, everything from evaluating applications and directly supporting our grantees to project managing garden installations. And in terms of how COVID-19 has impacted these 2 organizations and what we're doing right now, here in Vermont, all schools throughout the state were closed on March 18th. And pretty soon after, a decision was made to keep those schools closed for the rest of the year. So our district, like many others, is navigating how to continue educating our students remotely and figuring out how to provide meals to them. But many of the teachers I work with are also wondering what to do with their school gardens. Typically for us here, we don't start our school gardens and really get them going until mid-May, partially because early spring can be pretty chilly here. It's actually snowing right now. So we aren't really seeing much of our garden programming delayed. That being said, we are troubleshooting how to proceed with the growing season. So one of our first steps was to agree upon a unified approach to safety and sanitation for when folks do start working in the gardens. And secondly, many of our sites have been discussing how we can pivot a bit and ramp up production with the idea of growing more food than we normally would so that we can supplement our summer meal program or simply donate straight to families in need. So while I see far fewer students being involved in the gardens this spring and throughout the summer because of COVID-19, we do anticipate that the majority of our school gardens will be up and running within the usual timeframe. And this is just kind of, what's going on in our district. We're really fortunate that we have access to our school garden sites. That's something that's been allowed, but other folks might be in different situations. And, many people are having discussions about what to do with the upcoming or ongoing, depending upon where you are in the country, school garden season. And through my work with Kids Gardening, I'm seeing this play out. So our organization has seen an over 500% increase in traffic to our site, with a lot of folks looking for ideas for garden-based activities that kids can tackle at home. We have lots of teachers that are searching for lesson plans that they can share remotely with their students because they want to continue connecting kids to the garden right as the growing season is kicked off. And so at Kids Gardening, we're really leaning into how we can support school garden leaders and educators. We are constantly asking ourselves how we can help keep garden-based learning involved in remote learning and what we can do to support folks who are disconnected from their gardens. So that means we are aggregating resources from peer organizations to share alongside our lessons and activities. We are encouraging folks to share their garden-based remote learning plans, and we are extending our grant implementation deadlines since so many schools or nonprofits who have received funds from us may not be able to act on those proposed projects given the current crisis. And we're also striving to be really cognizant of the fact that gardening often requires space and resources that not everyone may have access to. So we're selectively highlighting activities that hopefully can be done with whatever you might have lying around your home. And in terms of how we are moving forward, as I mentioned, for our school district, we are having these ongoing conversations about how to approach the growing season. And we've definitely come to that consensus that we need to have some standard operating procedures that promote safety and sanitation when it comes to garden management. And this is something that I think all school and community gardens should be addressing. And while we have some time until we start growing here in Vermont, we are asking people to delay any sort of garden prep they might be doing at schools until May, seeing as we are approaching the time when cases might be reaching kind of a peak in our community. And then once we hit May, any work that might be done in school gardens, we're asking that that be completed by school staff and that we wait to integrate volunteers from our community until, after the school year ends. And these are both efforts to just limit possible chances of exposure to the virus. So overall, we're just being flexible and adjusting our timetables to fit the circumstances. And I think it's okay if things get pushed back or if certain things don't happen. This is a somewhat overwhelming time. And if you're a school garden or a community garden leader who needs to take a step back from having a functional growing space this year, I think that is okay. And it's not something you should feel guilty about. But on the other hand, if you choose to proceed with a garden, then I would definitely recommend having very clear expectations about safety, sanitation, and how people or which people should be involved in your space. And so I'm really eager to hear from our other panelists how their organizations are responding and what they're doing right now.
Thank you so much, Christine. Donna, would you like to go next?
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. So in my case, I wanted to give a little bit of background before we start talking about the community garden. I actually grew up in Jamaica, and at that time, my father, who was a residential contractor, my mother a nurse anesthetist, I never thought about gardening as agriculture. And so this goes back to Dr. Curry's presentation originally with food being grown in your backyard. At any point in time, we had 300 chickens every 2 weeks. We had several pigs in sties, and we would have, I would say, modestly at least access to at least 20 different fruits or vegetables around that grew in what we now call permaculture style. So that was my background. I did construction. I came to this from the perspective of construction and combining historic preservation with green building. And using LEED and leadership in energy and environmental design as a framework. I moved to Louisiana in 2011 because I came here to teach for the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training. Looked at the housing stock and the infrastructure and really wanted to help people who were living in poverty improve their houses. And that was the perspective that I came to this at. What I found out is that you cannot ask somebody to fix their house when they have a hard time just feeding themselves. And so as local food production was a part of LEED, I started to help people to learn to grow again. And so we started a couple community gardens, one in Natchitoches and one in Campty. At the time that I started working in Campty, Campty was the 8th most impoverished community in the United States with a population over 1,000. And so a lot of people were living way below the poverty line. And just basic needs were important. Well, what I found out and my perspective and what I've seen here in Louisiana is that land access is not an issue. just about everybody has enough space to grow a garden. And research has also told me that not only is land access, sorry, um, not a issue, but the other thing is that um, we have a lot of water, we have great sunshine, we have a long growing season. And on top of that, it wasn't too long ago where folks grew a truck patch. So there is knowledge of growing here. On the other hand, I did 2 community gardens and it was really hard to get volunteers to come out and work at those community gardens. And I realized that, the people we were attracting, and I worked with 2 different groups. One is seniors who remember growing and wanted to get back into it. And the other one is young people who were interested in getting their hands in the soil. And just as anywhere else, we find if we put their hands in the soil, not only will they grow the food, but they will eat the food. But because of the challenges we were having, instead of just growing through the community gardens, we moved to a format which was more in terms of intervale, which was a sustainable farm. So we did a sustainable agriculture demonstration farm. And then we used the farm as a tool to share information with others, which then meant that we could sell all of the produce or most of the produce that we generated to continue to maintain the farm. And with a goal of eventually hiring staff, hiring farmers, and having people work on the farm. And I think for us in Louisiana, and probably in the South, that tying that entrepreneurial perspective to it is critical, because that's when people get engaged. They're willing to come out to learn so that they can then increase their revenue stream. So that's the perspective that I come to this from. Has COVID-19 impacted farming in Louisiana? Absolutely. It's impacted everybody. Our school system is also closed down. The governor has, at least not as of yet, announced that it's closed for the year, but he has gotten the recommendation and is probably going to close it for the year. And so we have a lot of young people who are out there. Now, fortunately for us, because there is so much resident knowledge of agriculture in the community, if you go to any of the hardware stores, you will see they are just about sold out. I passed by a local hardware store and picked up 10 pounds of peas and wanted some squash, and they had no squash seeds. And they're like, it's been amazing, just the amount, the sales, the increase, because we have the tools within the community. We have the resources and we have the know-how. The challenge that we have is the will. And part of this, and I am not the one that's politically correct. I work with both communities, I work with everybody, but predominantly in the African American community, the interest to go back and grow their own food is not necessarily there. And that's because it took a long time and was a hard road to leave the farm. And they see going back to the farm as pretty much being punished. In the 70s and 80s here in Louisiana, school did not start for Blacks until the cotton was out of the field. And so it's still very, very recent. And I will talk to people about it, and they'll say, I don't want my grandchildren to farm. And so, I don't want my children to farm. So even though they did it, they don't want to pass that tradition on. And that's what we're going to need to counter. So that's part of the challenge. The other part of the challenge is there is no money in farming. That's the perspective. That's what you hear when you talk to people about farming and growing their own food. And so for me, it has been really important to stress the amount of food you can produce in small spaces and how much money you can make when you're direct selling that within the community. And so that has been a big part of the work that we do. Through the nonprofit organization, we partner with the Rosslyn Foundation, and we do the Back to Your Roots conference, which is an annual conference here in Louisiana. And we bring in, I call it the Masters Series. So we bring in people who have been farming for a long time and to share their knowledge in a 2-day technical sessions, technical workshops. We're doing an Art and Ag Festival, and for about 3 years, we did a youth agripreneurship class where we were working with young people and not just teaching them how to grow food, but sort of teaching them the value of that entrepreneurial initiative and how you can take a $1 pack of okra seeds and turn it into, a couple $1,000s within a season. So that's what has been beneficial and has been helpful here, is how we can make money and supplement income, not just for nutritional value. And I think it's going to come back around for the COVID-19, because this is something with a lot of people being unemployed, then this is a time where they can now rebuild the local food system and start to work together to not just grow your own food, but grow your family income.
Thank you so much, Donna. Laura, would you like to go?
Sure. I have the dubious honor of talking to you all after you've been talked to for a long time. But I will tell you that I am talking to you from Bellingham, Washington, and I'm the director of Common Threads. We're a nonprofit that we like to say we grow good eaters, primarily by joyfully connecting kids to healthy food through gardening, cooking, and eating programs, both in school and community settings. And a couple distinguishing features of our program that just might give you a little bit of context is, first of all, we're heavily reliant on AmeriCorps members as our boots on the ground. And so we've got a large team of 18 AmeriCorps members currently, which has meant that when schools closed, we had a lot of person power that we were able to really easily pivot to addressing some emergency food distribution and food security and food resiliency issues. The other thing I should share, especially since I've been watching the comment box and the number of people who are kind of like, ugh, how do I get to yes with my district? We work with 24 schools across 5 districts, and so have seen just the whole range of reactions from really conservative to really much more oriented towards how do we get to yes. And I know in Washington State, we've been trying to work on a state level through our Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction to get some guidance on access to school gardens, because it really does seem like for many of the districts that we're working with and that some of our partners are working with across the state, there's just a desire to have that level of permission given from the state. We haven't gotten there yet, so I'd be really curious to know if anybody else's state Department of Education has found the time and the bandwidth. I know they're dealing with a lot of other things to be thoughtful and declarative about school garden access. But so, and also just to tell you, Washington State, we have a statewide stay-at-home order. Currently, schools are closed for the rest of the year, and we haven't gotten any pushback, though, in terms of positioning ourselves as an essential business in terms of growing food, and also in terms of positioning positive outdoor recreational opportunities as an essential activity. So, you know, then of course we've just had to kind of think through the mechanics of that, both from a sanitation of tools perspective and from the perspective of appropriate social distancing. But we've really kept busy with a couple of different things. Immediately when schools were closed, we spent most of our organizational time supporting the school district's emergency food distribution. So we were doing a lot of packing of boxes and actually taking those boxes out to places in the community that had been identified. We're fortunate that in the Bellingham School District, which is where our home base is, we've, for the last 2 years, when we've had multiple days of snow closures, which you wouldn't guess looking at the sky behind me today, but sometimes it snows here. We've gotten pretty good at a response to distribute school meals to families that usually kicks in on day 3 of a snow closure. So when some families are out sledding and drinking hot chocolate, we recognize that some families are home and cold and hungry. And so we've been lucky to be working with a district that has been highly responsive to that. We're kind of done in our role with the emergency food distribution, mostly because some politics kicked in, and school staff are now filling those roles as part of their contract for the rest of the year, which has meant that we've been able to pivot yet again to looking at longer term food resiliency, both through our existing school gardens and also community gardens. And the other things we've been focusing on, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these, is resources for families that are learning at home. Christine, I saw your cool gardening at home challenge for April, and we're sharing that broadly. And the other thing we're really working on is some policy advocacy, both at a local level and a state level, for how do we take this really insecure and challenging time and use it as an opportunity to move systems to a place that you know, it might have taken us actually much longer to get to in more secure times. So for instance, we just are in the process of signing a contract with our city to build some new garden spaces that will be focused on specifically on growing more nutrient dense and good keeping staple crops. So lots of squash and beans. And our plan is to start from turf and then video document the building of the fence, the prepping of the beds, the planting of the beds, so that hopefully families can, on a smaller scale, follow along with some of this at home. I don't know if this has been true for all of you, but we've gotten tons of questions from families at home saying, it seems like I should be gardening right now, but I don't know how. And so I think there's just sort of been this awakening to how reliant so many of us are on a commercial food system, and how little so many of us know about how to grow food at home. In terms of kind of the conversations we've had with school districts, I with total appreciation for the desire to make sure that we're being safe and we're socially distancing and we're practicing sanitation. One of the arguments that I feel like I've reasonably successfully made is that while there's a risk in school gardening, there's actually a bigger risk in not school gardening, not only from a food production standpoint, but also from the perspective of joy and hope and resiliency, which I think are worthy endeavors in and of themselves. So right now we're gardening like heck at our school gardens. We're starting these new gardens. We're working on agreements and policies and protocol. And then I think really the next step for us is looking at what are the highest impact strategies for food distribution once we've got food to share. And what's seeming most obvious to us right now is partnering with our local food banks and also with our school food service emergency food distribution, because one of the things I'm hearing resoundingly from those folks is that although they're doing a great job with getting out a lot of quantity of food to hungry people, quality is suffering somewhat, especially around access to fresh produce, because especially as our school district has moved to shipping out a box a week at a time. And so in terms of perishable goods, there's not as much opportunity there. And our hope is that we might, in some small way, be able to help support access to more plant foods for our families. And the one other thing I'll add, and this is a little bit of a shameless promotion, is that we're actively recruiting our AmeriCorps team for next year, and something that we already foresee adding to our school gardening and cooking and low-income apartment cooking program is a grow and glean community garden corps. And so that's just something that we've gotten a lot of support from AmeriCorps and thinking about adding that to our repertoire of service opportunities.
Thank you so much, Laura. So now Eleanor is going to ask some questions, and I'm going to monitor the chat box. So Eleanor.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much. I was just fascinated hearing all the amazing ideas and the actual practices and strategies that everyone has been engaging with. And I don't want to take up too much time with some general questions so that we can have more time for the chat. So those of you who want to have your question put forward, you can go ahead and add it to the chat, and I'll just throw out for each of you, and maybe you can answer in order of the same way you introduce yourselves. It sounds like you're actually coming up with a lot of innovative ideas. Part of this is, of course, you've always had to kind of change perspectives and convince whether it's people in the community or administrators, if you're in a school district, or grant funders, whoever, that what you're doing is of value. But as you've come up with these innovations, can you just discuss a little bit about how you're trying to maybe document these, what skills or capacities you're building to make sure that you now have this evidence of the critical role these spaces are serving, whether for education, food security, or entrepreneurial activities? I mean, this is actually, as Donna pointed out, people in the greater population are primed to perhaps now understand the value of not just seeing these as little learning spaces, but actually a network of super important food repositories where we can really build our community food security and our community food system. So is what sounds like to convince people, you're doing a lot, but are you kind of looking ahead and thinking, here's some innovations, how are you documenting, or what new skills or capacities are you trying to kind of quickly pivot to and have part of your repertoire so that you now will have those numbers, facts and figures and stories to convince folks as we go forward? And Christine, you could start.
Okay, let me think. So In terms of my work with the school district, we are very fortunate that we have a lot of support from both building administrators and district level administrators. So I think that's kind of eased the transition of being able to have access to our school gardens. And I saw that some folks had asked about this, but trying to find an administrator who might be kind of like high up on that food chain, who can be an ally and really advocate for you and show that, you know, this is something that can really better your community, and the importance of food access and being able to potentially grow food for folks in need. And, you know, in terms of really looking at the impact that we're having, we are a small school district, but we have a pretty high free and reduced lunch rate. We have a large New American community, and a lot of folks that are really suffering right now. And so in addition to kind of keeping track of the numbers of folks that we're serving on a daily basis, we are hoping to really take advantage of the fact that our feeding sites are kind of these places where so many people are interacting in a safe way and having access to both not just food, but like school materials. So we're handing out Chromebooks and laptops and you know, paper worksheets to students as they come and they pick up food. We're also in the process of piloting a seed distribution program in partnership with our state farm to school network. So we're looking at being able to give folks seeds that can easily be grown in containers, so that, like, kind of regardless of the amount of space you might have, you can be able to do something and try growing your own food, or just, you know, germinating seeds at home as something fun to do with your kids, to kind of have them occupy time and learn something new. And we're hoping to take that model and potentially apply it to seedling distribution using the seedlings that we're growing in our greenhouse, and then eventually come the time that we are producing food in our gardens, that we were able to use our meal sites to share like garden fresh produce with folks. And then from the kids gardening side of things, I think one of the way we're really just trying to capture impact is by creating some sort of like crowdsourced community of knowledge. So the idea that there are so many people out there who are looking for tips and tricks and things to do. And so that is why we are kind of doing this contest that Laura had mentioned, where we are encouraging folks to submit the garden-based activities that they're doing at home, or the garden-based activities that they're sharing as part of remote learning plans with their students, and having people submit those ideas so that we can kind of aggregate all of them, share them with people so that folks can be inspired. But then there's also the kind of the added benefit of, you might get a little kind of like prize package of garden tools and things like that. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, but those are some of the innovative ways that we're really trying to like widen our impact.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, that definitely answers a lot of what I was thinking about with that. Donna, anything you would like to add about some of the innovations or new things you're trying that you're going to take forward, or that, you know, that whole shift in perspective that we were just talking about, that the times have now enabled you to maybe shift that mindset a little bit?
Yeah, so we are funded through a grant from, or a cooperative endeavor agreement with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And what we have been able to do is, in documenting and in partnering for these outreach events throughout the state, really gotten them to embrace organic agriculture a lot more, and to help them better work with beginning farmers who are interested in growing not just their own food, but food for others and in the community, etc. So that's one of the areas. And just this morning, when I was speaking to the NRCS representative, we were talking about the practices that are already funded that would help a beginning, and when we say beginning farmer, and this is something I had to really break down here, because we have a lot of gardeners who will grow a truck patch. They will plant a 1/4 acre and they'll say, oh, but that's my truck patch, you know? Well, a production. They may even do a couple acres of peas. You know, oh, we just put in a couple acres of peas each year. Um, but they don't see themselves as farmers because they're just gardeners. Well, I'm saying that's a farmer, and there are programs to help and to increase that production and to help you use it to generate revenue. On the flip side, we're taking what we're learning from the farmers and the challenges that we're having in implementing the programs. For example, in our case, we have a lot of rural communities. A lot of the people are on wells or do not have wells. So they will buy land and they will want to start farming but don't have access to water. And in Louisiana, there is a requirement that you have to wait 2 years to show that you were using water in a way that was less conserving, to say sprinkler, to then be able to get access to water for irrigation purposes. So it took us 2 years to get the well for Campty, for the farm in Campty. We got the high tunnels the first year, and we had to wait 2 more years. And so we were hauling water, which is the least efficient way to, to irrigate. And so there are practices in place that work really well for large farmers that just don't work well for small farmers who are interested in putting an acre or two into vegetable production to really improve our local food system. So that's one of the areas they're actually looking at all of their practices right now. And I am committed to spending time to share what we've learned throughout the state with NRCS so that they can modify those practices so that we can empower our gardeners to start doing more and farming and really building that local food system.
Thank you, Donna. Yeah, it sounds like policy, rules, regulations are all sort of speaking into this, and for wherever we are and whatever scale we're working at. Laura, did you want to add anything to this kind of line of thought?
I don't know that I have a whole lot to add other than just this piece about empowering families to take small steps to do more things at home, but also recognizing that we need to do it in a way that doesn't require them to go out and buy things that they might not have. And so we've also been playing with sort of these little resiliency starter packets. Haven't quite figured it out yet, but is there a way that we could even set folks up for a windowsill garden? Again, it's not going to address the food security, but it is going to address the socio-emotional part of this, which I think is also real and worth considering.
And I did see that you put in the chat that one strategy too you're moving forward with is you're creating sign-up sheets for volunteers and visitors to the school garden, and so that some families there are a number of families that are in self-isolation together, and they can actually come work as a group. So I think that would be a really positive step forward if they could get out of their house and into some of these spaces and actually, but you have to of course manage that in terms of time and access.
Yeah, and our signups aren't live quite yet, but they should be in the next couple of days. So if you want an example, and we're just using Sign Up Genius. If y'all don't know it, it's free and pretty intuitive as a way to just kind of schedule people in spaces.
So I'm going to actually open it up to the chat questions that are coming out there. And Robin or Wendy Sue, I know you've been monitoring chat. Do you want to pass along any questions for our panelists?
I would just add there were some questions about how do you overcome the obstacles to getting school gardens started? And this is, to gain access within school districts and things like that. And if panelists could address that, that might be helpful.
I'd be happy to start on that one if we go in reverse order. One of the things we've found is that, honestly, there's got to be a champion inside the school, a parent, a teacher, an administrator, a somebody, because I'm always really careful to tell folks that we can garden with you, but we can't garden for you, at least not in a sustainable fashion. And we've been doing school gardens, as I said, across multiple districts since 2009. And I would be happy to share with anyone who's interested the current incarnation of our things to think about if you want to start a school garden presentation that we do. That, I mean, there's lots of resources. There's a book called, I think it's called Starting a School Garden, that came out of San Francisco Education Outside. They did a great job, but it's really, in my experience at least, a lot of relationship building, and unless there's leadership from the tip top, sometimes it can take time. I do know we've got some districts in Washington State where they've got a teacher on special assignment who's a sustainability and garden specialist. So I mean, there's certainly districts that are just miles ahead in terms of getting this going. But if you're feeling like you're just having a hard time getting to yes, I'd be happy to share some resources on that.
I will say, so I worked with a Montessori school in Florida. I was actually working on the building and an addition of 11 classrooms, but they had a wonderful school garden, which we enhanced as part of the program. And what I found that they did that worked really, really well for them was that because it was a Montessori school and it had a middle school component, not only did they grow the food, but they started their own little farmers market on Wednesday afternoons where they could sell produce, and it went to their green club. And that was wonderful because it was fully incorporated into their curriculum. They were running a business out of this, and it went back into resources for the school. And so that worked very well. And I think it's a wonderful model. I see a lot here in Louisiana. We actually have a large 4-H and large FFA, Future Farmers of America, component here. The challenge with it, however, is that it is limited to a lot of the haves versus the have-nots when it comes to that. And so for me, teaching folks organic agriculture where they can use what they have, whether it's to build the soil and make the beds and grow seeds and so forth, and then using it to generate revenue, has worked very, very well here in Louisiana. Other things that work in Florida because of the tight space don't necessarily translate to the rural community here.
I guess instead of sharing some of my insights, I'll just share a couple of resources that I've found, and a lot of folks in my area have found to be really incredibly helpful for both starting school gardens and then tackling how to deal with school gardens in kind of our current climate right now. So in Vermont, there's an organization called Vermont Food Education Every Day, VT Feed, and they have produced a number of really, really comprehensive guides about both creating school garden programs, connecting to your cafeterias, increasing local procurement efforts and things like that. So that can be a really great place to start and kind of troubleshoot. But then there's also a really wonderful organization called the School Garden Support Organization, or SGSO Network. And technically this is a group that's aimed at folks who support multiple school gardens, But currently there are some really, really valuable conversations that are happening right now that I think could be really applicable to just folks, focusing on a single garden. So they have this online forum right now that is just buzzing on a daily basis with recommendations for, everything from school garden management to remote garden learning during COVID. And a lot of people are sharing resources. There are videos of people reading garden themed books. There are links to people teaching lessons in the garden or YouTube channels that have been set up. And so it's just, I think, a really wonderful network right now that is providing a ton of really great ideas for this current time, but also just in general.
Then the other questions that came up, and I'll just throw both of these out. Any advice on recruiting community garden members where you're in an area that doesn't really have internet, not a lot of good connection to internet? And then there was a question on virtual gardening or interactive garden videos, since a lot of people are quarantined.
Laura, do you want to start again? We'll go in reverse order, or?
Well, I mean, I was thinking when you asked that first question of what to do when people don't have internet, and I was just reflecting. It's not something we've done, but I was reflecting on, and I don't know where it would work. I was reflecting on an NPR story I heard about somebody in New York City who went and put sticky notes on their neighbors' doors just saying, hey, are you doing okay? I mean, I don't know how we reach out to folks right now without internet, other than, that really high touch, or if it's word of mouth, or if it's posters on telephone poles. But I think it's a great question. And I mean, on the other one, just about resources, I think one of the dilemmas that we've felt is like trying to figure out how to curate the resources that are already out there and share them as thoughtfully as possible and reinvent as few of them as possible, because there really are, I mean, whether it's kids gardening or edible schoolyard or Life Lab, there's a number of organizations that are just doing fantastic stuff with content, and that's where I would encourage folks to look first if you're looking for stuff to share out with your community.
I will go back to what my son says, and between Google and YouTube, you can learn anything you want to out there. But sadly for us, I had to put in an additional internet signal, a MiFi, because the Wi-Fi that I pay for, HughesNet, is really, really poor. And just driving through several of our communities, you will have no cell signal at all, much less internet bandwidth. So that's one of the challenges in rural communities, where not only are you further apart, but you do not have internet. You can't take internet for granted. It's not available in many, many places. So it is reaching out literally one door at a time. For us, the church is one of those places that we can go to get to a larger group of people and to share information and to share resources. And so what I'm seeing a lot of in Louisiana, in addition to, schools starting, because we have now got a fairly dynamic farm to school program, or at least in the works. But is that churches are picking up that banner and starting to put in gardens at church where they're growing food for their church community and the community. And I think that's where we're going to see the biggest growth in this COVID-19 process, is that churches are going to come on board and start growing foods for the community again.
Donna, thank you for that. Excuse me for popping in here. I just wanted to note the time and thank all of our participants for chiming in. I know some of you were coming in on your lunch hour and maybe need to get going, but I just wanted to let you know that the panelists have kindly agreed to stay for another 10-15 minutes if you continue to have questions, and we'll stay till the bitter end here. But I wanted to thank all of you for joining, and just to let you know that we'll be here again next week at the same time. And as I mentioned, we'll be thinking about the eating side of our food system challenges in our next week's episode, about how do we consider sustainability in our eating and eating habits when we're all some of us are encountering shortages and where we can't get the kinds of food that we're accustomed to. I also wanted to mention that we have a podcast that has come out. I'll put the link in the chat there, that talks about the work that graduate students in sustainable food systems are doing with the support of their advisors. And this week the episode focuses on dairy and working with our dairy farmers who have been hit by financial challenges in the last few years. So anyway, there's more discussion to be had, and I will hand the mic back to you, Eleanor, for continued facilitation of Q&A, and you, Wendy Sue. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Robin. So I'll let Wendy Sue gather her thoughts as if she's seeing another question pop up. But I thought of a question that, in all the things that you've been sharing, has got me thinking really long term in terms of we don't know our future going 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. But has any of what's happening in the last month or so, and as you do this short term contingency planning and adjusting and adapting, but has this sparked any thoughts in all of your minds about where you might suddenly pivot and see yourself moving with some of these organizations and projects and initiatives going 5 years into the future? I mean, as all of you seem so united in trying to help us build healthier, stronger community-based food systems, both in terms of education and access and entrepreneurial opportunities to grow that economy. Just, anything that now you're thinking long term that we are suddenly kind of envisioning.
I'll take that first. So in terms of our school gardens over the summer, oftentimes we are very, very focused on kind of growing finite amounts of food for specific summer programming, or delaying a lot of our planting so that it is then harvestable come the fall, so that students can take advantage of that. In an effort to try and minimize the amount of work that we have over the summer. And this year we're kind of throwing all that to the wind and saying, let's try and create the most work possible so that we can grow the most food possible to help support families in need. And I think, that's a conversation that we can continue to tackle in the future, because the reality is that, food issues related to food access are, not just arising now. They are a full-time reality for many people. And so, whether or not we have the capacity to do that on an annual basis, that we're growing food for both programming, but we're also making a huge effort to focus on supporting our community or supporting families directly through our summer feeding programs and things like that. And I think that'll take some thought and it'll take some people power, but it's definitely, I think, a conversation that we will now be having as we kind of pivot and really begin to focus on that for this particular growing season.
I would say one of my aspirations is that everybody starts to grow food in their backyard. Growing up in Jamaica, it was part of our culture. Everybody grew something. We didn't think we were gardening, we didn't think we were farming, we didn't call it either one of those, but everybody did it. And even though we may have traveled the world and dispersed all over, you can tell a Jamaican because if they have an inch of space, they're trying to grow something in it, okay? All they need is a pot of soil. If you're in New York and you go to the Bronx and you can tell they're growing food. And it's not about growing flowers, although there are a lot of edible ones out there. It's about growing food. Um, when I read the oral histories, and I spent a lot of time doing research prior to coming to Natchitoches Parish and looking at, and this just happened to be there because, you know, the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training was here in the Cane River National Heritage Area. And they had done these oral histories, and 80%, I started tagging what were the commonalities as I read through everybody's oral history. And over 80% of them talked about agriculture in one form or another. My grandmother did this. I remember doing this with my father. I remember going to the bar. Shelling peas was a big one, you know, just on and on and on. This was part of the culture here. Everybody grew food for themselves. And I would love to see that again, that 80% at least start growing food, whether it's on the balcony of their apartment or it's in their backyard or they call it a truck patch or whatever. And that network actually still is in place where there are people who will do a full-blown truck patch just for others to come to the community and harvest. And they're okay with that. And so every year they'll put it in just for that. I would love to see more of that happening again, because that is true food security, when you can go into your backyard and harvest your next meal.
So, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I just put something in the chat box. I don't know if you all have been following the Sow Grow Unite efforts nationally, but they're using Craigslist as a communication system for, you know, what do you have, what do you need, how can we build community? And I haven't dug into it enough yet, but I do think that's, you know, I agree that this will be hopefully the long-term silver lining, is that we're all more thoughtful about recognizing that we all can grow food, and we probably all should, at least a little bit.
So there was a comment in the chat box about using mail order packages for distribution of literature and tools, and I'll just let people address that if they would like. And another one just came up about growing food hydroponically in your home or apartment.
Mm.
I will take the mail order one, because quite frankly, you know, everything that's old is new again, and mail order worked in the past. There are a lot of homes built here in rural communities that were part of the Sears mail order catalog, which they purchased. So I think that mail order would work. I really am waiting to see what happens, you know, post April 30th, because just driving through the rural communities now, we're starting to see a lot more truck patches. A lot more people have access to tractors. They are starting just, a garden. And everybody has tilled the ground. I drove down to Campty to bring up some animals the other day, and there was a gentleman that was right opposite the high school he hasn't grown anything there for a few years, but he's tilled his garden in and he's getting ready to plant. I think we're going to see a lot more locally produced food coming out of our communities now. Because people have to. They see the importance. And so they will dig back up in that brain and go brush off the skills and get to work and start growing. And I think it's our job now just for the younger generation, one, tell them that it's okay to fail. Okay, we've all killed a plant. It's all right. Go plant it anyway. And it's fine. Get started where you are with what you have. It doesn't matter if it's just one tomato plant. That's fine. That's better than not doing one tomato plant. I think once we empower them that way, we'll see a lot of growing going on.
And,
Yes.
and then one last question, any national groups you'd recommend doing advocacy and education related to gardening now? Haven't seen too much from the American Community Garden Association. There's lots of good regional resources, but is there a national group working on this?
So I'd like to make a plug for Food Corps. It's an AmeriCorps organization aimed at connecting, specifically like bettering school food communities. I myself served in Food Corps for 2 years in Maine, back in 2013 through 2015. And I think they're a wonderful organization that are trying to really recruit regional folks to serve in their communities, and work not just on school gardens and local procurement and cafeterias, but just like in general, food access and equity. And they have a number of really great resources that they have released in light of the COVID-19 epidemic. Things aimed at resources, aimed at families, aimed at school nutrition professionals, and then just general community members. And there's information about gardening, there's educational resources, and there's a lot of just resources on equity and the way that this crisis is impacting particular communities disproportionately, and how we can have, positive and productive discussions about these things to tackle the kind of inequities and injustices that are really, really being highlighted by what's going on right now. And I've just put a link to that resource page in the chat. And I would highly recommend checking out what they're doing. They aren't in every single state. They have to work under host organizations. And so there is a process to having Food Corps members come to your state. And then there's a process for becoming a site where a Food Corps service member can function. And their website would have information on how to kind of jumpstart that process.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you, everyone. These are all just great resources. And the one little follow-up question, which you sort of just addressed, Christine, is how can you get Food Corps into states that aren't already participating? And as you mentioned, it's not in every state, but it does inspire me to think that with some good national leadership, somehow, somewhere, maybe we'll get more of these support for all of these projects you're doing through the good old kind of model of like the Civilian Conservation Corps, which again, AmeriCorps and Food Corps are modeled after, so that we can get all these young people that are now more aware of the need for build a more resilient future, get them really involved in their own communities and rebuilding the food shed. All these kids that have been doing all the school gardening as youngsters are now getting older and ready to apply those skills in a very serious way. And I think having this kind of strategic conversation and thinking leads us to want to have some policy behind that and continued support and growth in these areas. Wendy Sue, unless there's anything else on the chat, I guess we could say we can let some closing thoughts. If our panelists would like to share anything else that we have not asked you or that no one else has asked, some parting thoughts that you want to say, your last words, that'll be a great way to wrap things up.
I would just like to say thanks to all of you in Prescott for pulling this together and holding the space for the conversation.
I would like to say thank you all for inviting me. I do want to share that a couple things. USDA Farm Service Agency has both microloans for those who are interested in
there, make the duty,
as well as for young people, there are Farm Service youth loans for them to get started farming. So for anybody who is interested, there are programs that would assist them. And I think that's a resource that a lot of people don't know is out there on the small side. Everybody sees what big ag gets funded, but they don't see the programs that are available there to start with building local food systems. And then through NRCS, the programs that they have, the cost share programs that give you like up to 20,000 for a high tunnel so that you can grow, and there is no minimum size. And no, so if you have an acre and a half an acre or in a city and you have just a plot of land, you can still qualify for the high tunnel program. And these are all federal programs that are available to anybody throughout the United States.
Yeah, and I guess finally, I'd like to say that I really appreciate all the incredible resources that have been shared during this webinar and the way that we've kind of been able to highlight the things that are working for us and discuss some of the stumbling blocks. One of the silver linings that I think has come out of all of this is just the way that people have really banded together to support one another and to share resources and to aggregate best practices. And I think that, being able to be in a place where we can have this discussion and share all the things that are, working for us and figuring out how we can move forward is really incredible.
Thank you. Thank you to Laura and Donna and Christine for agreeing to be panelists today. And Wendy Sue and Eleanor, thank you for facilitating a really excellent conversation. And I think the chat is the most valuable resource that comes out of this conversation. So thank you everybody for your active participation in the chat and the great resources and advice that you were sharing while the main conversation was happening. So I really appreciate it. I think all of our panelists have been really generous with their contact information, and so that was included in the chat. If you registered for the webinar, you'll automatically get an email with the recording and the chat also, usually by the end of Friday. So you should be getting it by the end of the day today. But thank you everybody for joining and putting your heads together for something we all really care about, which are our school gardens and our community gardens. So wishing you all the best, and till next week.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.